Good evening and welcome to a night of philosophy. My name is David Copenhafer and I'm going to be talking with you for a little while about John Cage's Indeterminacy. And I've written a piece that's about interruption, which seems to accord well with what's happening this evening. Indeterminacy, what is it? It's a piece that Cage wrote and that came out in 1959, and it was a double album that he produced with his friend and longtime collaborator David Tudor. So it's 90 minutes long, and it features 90 stories, each of which is 1 minute long. So this creates an interesting kind of rhythm and tempo, because if a story only has a few words, then he reads it relatively slowly in order for those words to fill in the minute. But if the story has many words, then he reads at a faster tempo. Now, Cage recorded his part on his own without listening to his collaborator, David Tudor. David Tudor played piano, prepared piano, magnetic tape, and radios to create this accompaniment, following Cage's directions. But the intention was to make the relationship between the speaking and the accompaniment oblique. You might say indeterminate. So the name of the piece, Indeterminacy, refers in large measure to this unpredictable relationship between the voice and the accompaniment. That's primarily what I want to really focus on, this interrelation between voice and, let's call them musical sounds, but you may find some of them harsh and electronic, but whatever David Tudor is doing, I'm interested in this rapport between the two of them. So indeterminacy was a concept Cage brought to bear on many of his compositions. It refers to a lack of determination concerning some element of the production of sound or music, whether pitch, duration, volume, or timbre. If I gave you 3 notes and asked you to play them within a 1 minute time period, but left it to you at what point and how long to play them for, that would be a composition with indeterminacy. If I further said that the 3 notes should be chosen by means of chance operations, that would be to raise the level of indeterminacy. Within the piece Indeterminacy, I would say that Cage's part is fairly determined. The words are written down, and Cage has decided to read them within the space of a minute. The production of the nonverbal sounds was less determined and relied on chance operations, but the highest indeterminacy of the piece is no doubt the unpredictable interaction between the voice and its accompaniment. So this will make more sense if I play you an excerpt from Indeterminacy and you can hear for yourself what this sounds like. So I would say attend to the story that Cage is telling, but also try to figure out how it's interacting with David Tudor's sounds.
One day when the windows were open, Christian Wolff played one of his pieces at the piano. Sounds of traffic, boat horns, were heard not only during the silences in the music, but being louder, were more easily heard than the piano sounds themselves. Afterward, someone asked Christian Wolff to play the piece again with the windows closed. Christian Wolff said he'd be glad to, but that it wasn't really necessary, since the sounds of the environment were in no sense an interruption of those of the music.
Okay, so that final line, the sounds of the environment were in no sense an interruption of the music, that could be taken as a kind of motto for much of Cage's composition across his lifetime. He famously brought in the sounds of the environment into composition practice. But did you catch the sort of point of this story? His student, Christian Wolff, was playing the piece at the piano, environmental sounds were coming in through the window, and Christian Wolff said, well, I could play it again with the windows closed, but it doesn't really matter because for me those sounds are just as interesting as what I'm doing. Now, the question for me is, does that remark apply equally well to indeterminacy? there are these two tracks, right? The speaker and the accompaniment. Do the interruptions of the accompaniment track, when they interrupt John Cage's speaking, are they meant to be considered not interruptions really, but just as important as anything that's being said? And that's kind of the gambit or the question of the piece in some ways. So again, to refer to the piece we just heard, when Christian Wolff is interrupted, it's a piano that's being interrupted by, let's say, a boat horn in the distance. But when Cage is being interrupted, it's his own voice and a story, a narrative. So you see this correspondence, but it's not an exact correspondence. On one hand, piano interrupted by environmental sounds. On the other, Cage's prepared story interrupted by his score. So it's not quite the same compositional situation, but he seems to have been very interested in this equality of sounds, this idea that even though he's telling a story, even though it's his voice, he doesn't necessarily give priority to his voice, that he, in some sense, welcomes interruption and the drowning out of what he's saying. So I would say that ultimately Cage challenges the listener to listen to his voice, to Cage's voice, in such a way that the meaning of the words subsides and allows for the so-called accompaniment or background sound to rise up in importance. Other questions one could ask is it possible to unlearn our love for stories, the terrible force of narrative, in order to engage with the sounds in the moment? Now, I'm going to have to leave that question in suspense for a moment and turn to a slightly related issue, this issue that I alluded to earlier having to do with tempo in Indeterminacy. So, as I mentioned, there are 2 or 3 or multiple rates at which Cage speaks. And you can imagine that if Cage speaks more slowly, then there's going to be more time and space for musical sound to interrupt that interval. So if he speaks more quickly, there will be interruption, but a different kind of interruption where there's correspondence between his voice and the background sound. So it's a different entity. So what I'm going to play for you now are 2 excerpts from Indeterminacy, 2 stories. They're each 1 minute long. And one is read at a slower tempo and the other one more quickly, and you can hear this kind of difference between speeds and the way interruption plays out differently.
When I told David Tudor that this talk on indeterminacy was nothing but a series of stories, he said, "Don't fail to put in some benediction." I said, "What in heaven's name do you mean by benedictions?" "Blessings," he said. "What blessings?" I said. "God bless you, everyone." "Yes," he said. "Like they say in the sutras, this is not idle talk, but the highest of truths." Down in Greensboro, North Carolina, David Tudor and I gave an interesting program. We played 5 pieces 3 times each. They were the Kaddish Strip 11 by Karl Stockhausen, Christian Wolff Duo for pianists, Morton Feldman's Intermission No. 6, Earl Brown's 4 systems, and my variation. All of these pieces are composed in various ways that have in common indeterminacy of performance. Each performance is unique, as interesting to the composers and performers as to the audience. Everyone in front becomes a listener. I explained all this to the audience before the musical program began. I pointed out that one is accustomed to hear a piece of music is not always suitable for understanding and subsequent evaluation, but that here the situation is quite other. These pieces, I said, are not objects, but processes, essentially purposes. Naturally, then, I had to explain the purpose of having something like processes. I said the sounds were just sounds, and that if they weren't just sounds, we would, I was, of course, in the editorial blue, we would do something about it with next competition. I said that since the sounds are sounds, escape is the hearing of the text of the people, centered within themselves where they actually are, not off artificially in distance as they are accustomed to be, trying to figure out what is being said by some artist by means of sounds. Finally, I said that the purpose of this purposeless music could be achieved if people learn to listen. That when they listened, they might discover that they preferred the sounds of everyday life to the ones they were about to hear in the musical program, that was all right as far as I was concerned.
Okay, I wish we had a bit more time to talk about those two excerpts in some more detail, but I'm afraid I've got to keep things moving a little bit more quickly than I might like. I'll say that in listening to Cage's stories again and again, I became particularly enamored of the sounds that rise to fill in the spaces in between words. And I decided to remove them from the entirety of Cage's recording and to create a new audio track, one made up entirely of interstitial sounds, or sounds that occur in the gaps between words. So this track has well over 100 pieces. I spent a long time with a cursor just cutting them out of this sound file, and my hand hurts as a result. But can you imagine doing this back in the 1950s with a razor blade and pieces of magnetic tape? It's an incredible labor to imagine some 50 years ago, artists like Cage and Pierre Schaeffer engaging in. So it's this track of the interstitial sounds that I now want to add to the sound of my own voice to create a new sort of indeterminate composition, one that I hope will enable us to better understand this strange relationship between voice speaking while accompanied or not accompanied by other kinds of non-vocalic sound. So bear with me just a moment. Okay, in playing the interstitial sounds in the background, I want to complicate matters even further by taking a detour through a French language poem. This is the French Embassy, cultural services of the French Embassy that we're in after all. So I thought I would refer to this poem by Henri Michaud, which I think may help us delve even deeper into this question of indeterminacy and of the relationship between pieces that may or may not fit so well together. This poem is called Le danger des associations de pensée, or in English, The Danger of Associated Thoughts. I'll read it first in French and then in my own English translation. Can you hear all the levels reasonably well? No, that's part of the piece. C'est beau, une scie de scieur de long, une scie qui puissamment, souplement, tranquillement avance dans une vie de roi pesante, qu'elle tranche souverainement. C'est beau aussi une poitrine, très beau, dedans, dehors. Mais, comme c'est misérable, une poitrine sous une scie qui approche imperturbable, comme c'est misérable, surtout si c'est la vôtre. Et pourquoi vous êtes arrêté la pensée sur la scie, alors qu'il n'y a que votre corps qui vous intéresse, dont la scie par ce fait approchera fatalement. It's beautiful, a saw, a lumberjack saw that moves tranquilly, softly, powerfully through a heavy log. It cuts with sovereignty. A stomach is also beautiful, very beautiful inside and out. But how miserable a stomach beneath a saw that imperturbably approaches. How miserable, especially if it's your own. And why you, having halted thought at the saw, when you're only interested in your own body, which, for that reason, the saw approaches fatally. Henri Michaud from La Vie dans les Plis, 1949, 10 years before Cage's Indeterminacy. So here, Henri Michaud points out a concern, as ridiculous as it is unavoidable, that having been given two words, two things, a saw and a stomach, it will be impossible for thought not to bring them together in a way that the poet describes as miserable. We all know this problem of unhappy associations. Our thought is relentlessly associative, and the only thing that saves us from unhappy associations is perhaps yet another association. Our inability to keep certain thoughts discrete, separated, is like our inability to hear sounds in themselves. In my analogy, the saw is the word, the meaning that threatens to overwhelm and destroy one's effort to abide within or with the stomach, with or within the sound. The analogy is not perfect, for the stomach does not illustrate the saw, the way music threatens to become mere illustration of Cage's words. but something about the being of the stomach, the being of the music, suffers through its association with the cutting of the word or the cutting of the saw. To return to Indeterminacy, the piece, more explicitly, if it's not clear, I should state that what interests me most about it is the relationship between the voice and its accompaniment. It seems impossible that the sounds played by David Tudor should be listened to as intently as the voice, because the voice is not just speaking disjointed words or nonsense, but is actually relaying a series of narratives. It is almost impossible not to follow something with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and to give that narrative priority over its accompanying sound. And yet the musicality of Cage's voice, as well as his off-stated attention of doing away with hierarchies in listening, make me wonder how he thinks one might be able to listen to Indeterminacy. Is it possible, desirable even, to listen in such a way that one loses track of the meaning of the stories and begins to hear the background sounds as being on the same level as the voice? This is by no means easy. When, for example, at the end of one story, Cage thematizes the idea of listening to everyday sounds, it is difficult for me not to hear what comes after as the sound of keys jangling. But to do so, I think, is to commit a kind of phenomenological error, an error of precognition, of allowing the prior description of the sound to have too much influence on how one hears it. Again, it's difficult not to do this, at least sometimes, not to let Cage's naming of things lead to the imaginary recognition of the sound of that thing. To take another example, in one of the stories in Indeterminacy, Cage mentions opening a door. It's hard not to hear the sound that comes after is illustrative of that door opening. But to do so, to hear sound in this way, is to betray precisely the attention to sound in itself, which Cage calls for both in Indeterminacy and throughout his long career. So I was tempted to call this lecture or performance the problem of illustration. And if it's not clear what I'm getting at, it has to do with Cage naming things like a door or, more generally speaking, everyday sounds, and then this tendency to want to hear what comes after that naming as the thing that was just referred to. But I'm arguing that that's a kind of error, a mistake of listening. But that's not the point of what Cage is doing. He's not trying to create a story that's being illustrated by sounds in the background. He's trying, on a much more radical level, to equalize the occurrence of sounds with his own narrative storytelling. But he's showing us at the same time that it's so hard not to put the priority on the voice, because we like stories. Everybody likes stories and wants to glue themselves to the progression of the voice. But that, in fact, I think is not the artistic effort of Indeterminacy.